brief bio, if you don't mind, please.
Yes, Ken, I'm 56. I joined the nationalist movement when I was 15. I joined the National Front, which was at that stage the biggest nationalist party in Britain in 1974. Went through all the various, ways in which nationalist parties change and ended up leading the British National Party between 1999 and last year. I was elected as a member of the European Parliament in the biggest electoral breakthrough that any British nationalist party has ever had in our history, and served there as the most outspoken member of the European Parliament. There's 700 of them, in fact more than that, and most of them are liberal leftists or cowardly conservatives who wouldn't say boo to a goose, and I was rather different. I now lead an organisation called British Unity. We're really quite recently founded. People will find us on Facebook, British Unity, Nick Griffin. We've already built up a huge reach on that. Once we've built the reach up more, we're going to be moving into demonstrations against the people who are messing up our country, because Britain's got all the same kind of problems that you Americans are all too well aware of.
Yeah, now you say that you have a Facebook presence. Tell us that. Tell us how to find you on Facebook one more time.
Well, if you just search British Unity, Nick Griffin, you'll find it there. We've got a present. We've only been going 3 months. We've got a weekly reach of over 1 million. We've got only 3,000 likes, but we've got regularly 25, 30,000 people talking about it. So we've got a lot of really good activists out there spreading the message.
Yeah, that's a good start. Do you happen to have a website, by the way? Or is that in the making?
We haven't yet. That's coming very shortly.
Okay, well, we'll be looking forward to that. The thing that concerns me, Nick, is what is happening in Europe is happening throughout the Eurosphere, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, wherever there are white people. It seems there is a concerted effort, and by the way, I don't believe in these harebrained conspiracy theories, but it's undeniable that somebody, for some reason, is trying to destroy us. Well, here's the question for you. We see this happening in Britain. We see it happening in all of Europe, and I don't. What is the remedy? There are people who say what should be done. We need to just kick everybody out, but I'm not sure that's practical. It's going to happen. So the question is not necessarily what should be done, but what can be done. What do we do to reverse this? Stop it.
The main point now. The process, it's described as the White Genocide Project. One of the most controversial speeches that are made in the European Parliament was when I spoke and exposed a man called Richard Kalergi, who was one of the main people. It's not really a conspiracy, you're right, because it's quite open. They've really always said what they were going to do. And he was one of the founders of the European Union. He was also one of the founders of the idea of wiping the white race off the face of the planet through mass immigration and then miscegenation. But as you say, it's too late to say we can reverse the whole thing completely, not least because our parents and ourselves also didn't do enough, sat back and enjoyed the good times while this was done to us. So now it's a question of what can be done. It's a huge question, isn't it? I think the first thing is to look at ways in which we can say what we want to say in ways that don't automatically terrify people who've been brought up with a leftist liberal teaching establishment and with the mainstream media, so they're terrified of being racist. So what I do very often if I'm talking to someone who's a little bit liberal or brainwashed is to say, look, the point about humanity, the good thing about humanity is our diversity, and the ethnologists, people studying languages and people, say that at present in the world there's about 5,000 languages, 5,000 cultures. But by the end of this century, that'll be down to 800 and dropping. And that's a catastrophic wipeout of human diversity, and it's that diversity which makes human beings interesting. It actually makes us human. It's the differences which define who we are. And so if this wipeout of diversity was going on in any other species on the planet, all the ecologists and the Greens would be saying this is terrible. And it would be. And when we say that the peoples of the Western world and peoples of European stock, we're entitled to and should have a place of our own, a space of our own, and the right to bring up our children in our culture and our heritage, to marry kids just like them, we're not putting down other people's. We're actually saying that every single people on the planet have got that right. And in fact, people all over the planet are losing it. Partly, in the end, it's not just the people who've deliberately done it. I think it's one of the consequences of global capitalism and the information age and large passenger jets, that there's going to be a tendency for people to mix and a tendency to lose our cultures. So all of humanity has to work to find a sort of an ideological way of expressing the fact that it's a good thing that we should be diverse. And if diversity is a stepping stone to integration, where we all become a coffee-coloured, mixed-race, cultureless people swigging the Coca-Cola, eating McDonald's everywhere we are in the world, that's a bad thing. And we need to find ways, all of us, to stand up against it and preserve our God-given differences.
It seems to me that the assault is against people of European ethnic heritage, white people. I don't see this happening in Africa, for example. I don't see this happening in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't see there is a move to integrate black Africa at all. I don't see a move to integrate...
Not, but if you look, for instance, at South America, and if you want to play mind games with a liberal, you can talk about the tribes of the Amazon who are disappearing, and then say, and it's wrong they're disappearing, but it's also wrong the white tribes are disappearing. Then that's the logic, and you're absolutely right. That, of course, the only people who are being deliberately wiped off the face of the earth through mass immigration and pernicious propaganda through the controlled mass media, that's us, it's white people.
Well, let me ask you this question, and I've got my opinion on this, and I may share it, but I talk on the radio all the time, so I don't necessarily need to. We want to know what Nick Griffin says. And the question is this: why are they doing it to us? Why do they hate us? Why don't they like us? We'll be back in 3 minutes, and we'll be looking forward to Nick Griffin's answer. You're listening to the American Freedom Party News Hour.
You're listening to the American Freedom Party News Hour with your host, Ken Daly.
Let me give you that web address one more time. It is theamericanfreedomparty.us. We encourage you to visit our website. If you are not a member of the American Freedom Party, I encourage you to join. It only costs $25 for a year. And what that allows you to do is not be a bystander watching the world go to pot, so to speak, but you can be a part of a movement that is having an effect on public policy. That's what the American Freedom Party is all about. We don't expect you to agree with everything the party in the party's platform. I'm not sure I agree with everything in it. We're not going to agree together on every little issue. But the point is, we do need to stand together. And so when you join the American Freedom Party, you are a part of a movement that is dedicated to making a difference. So you're no longer just a keyboard commando sitting back looking and observing as the world falls apart, but you're an activist doing something about it. We're talking to Nick Griffin, of the former chairman and president of the British National Party. He was a member of the European Parliament from 2009 until, well, I guess last year, 2014. And before we went to the break, Nick, I was asking you why it is that whoever it is that's doing it, I just call them the bad guys for lack of a better term, why are they doing it to us? What is it about white people they don't like?
Well, I think that first of all, you have to think a lot of this in the end is about money and power. And there's a number of interlocking would-be global elites, people like the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, all these groups who people will say, it's a conspiracy theory. No, it's not. These things are facts. And these people want to control, they want a one-world government, they want to control the herd. And the only peoples, really, who've historically stood up to this kind of thing, the peoples of the world who've given the world the ideas of liberty, of freedom, of self-determination, of the rule of law, whereby the rich are equal to the rest of us, the super rich particularly, that's the white nations. So while you've got the white nations, there can be a revolt on your global plantation. You get rid of the white nations, and there'll be no revolt. Your power's there forever. So that's, I think, that's really what it's all about. And then within this, I think these people, they found particularly one group who are very, very effective as their shock troops. The ones who, in terms, whether it's organising demonstrations against so-called racists on the streets, through to the colleges and academia, through to the mass media, the shock troops of globalization and the deliberate attempted genocide of the white race are radical racist Jews who, it starts with the Talmud, which preaches a very, very crude, simplistic form of contempt and hatred for other peoples. And then that filters into two different groups. Not all Jews. There's plenty of Jews, actually, who don't like this. There's even some who speak out about it. But overall, you've got a very significant number on the right, so-called politics, now in the United States with the neocons, and also on the left with virtually all the communist movements, the intellectuals of the communist movements, starting with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels through to the Frankfurt School, which have devastated our society in recent decades. And all of these people, they may, in fact, some of them disown their Jewish heritage, but something comes with that, this Talmudic hatred of other peoples, and in particular, the hatred of Christianity.
So you're not anti-Jewish, you're not anti-Semitic, you're just noting that there's an element within that element that seems to be causing a problem.
Yes, yeah, exactly so. When I don't like it when people say everything is the fault of the Jews, whatever it may be, the weather and so on, and they're all the same. It's a patent nonsense. It's very unjust, and it makes our cause look bigoted and stupid. It's rather, and then they say, but well, why don't the ordinary Jews stand up against this? Well, how many of our people stand up against the white Gentile elite? And there's plenty of them. The Bushes of this world and so on. These people are part of the problem. I think right at the top, you're not talking about any ethnic group or religion. You're talking about an incredibly greedy, power-hungry elite. And as I say, the fact that they have found certain shock troops and they use them doesn't mean that all Jews are the same. It's just the same as when you talk about anti-white racism. There's a huge amount of racism. In fact, I'm sure the majority of racism, real racism that hurts people in the Western world and in the United States, is black on white racism. That's the problem no one is allowed to talk about, but it's a real problem. But to say that doesn't mean to say that you're saying that all blacks are racist. Of course they're not. Some are, some aren't.
Have you been watching the events in Newcastle, England? One of the demonstration, I think it was Saturday. One of the things that popped in my head that was kind of obvious when I was watching the events there were so many white British people who were taking a stand in favor of the displacement of Western culture. And I'm wondering, it's obvious that somebody got inside their head. I call it the multicultural virus. And it's infected them, it's infected millions of people. But the question is, how are they doing this? How can these people be so blind as to not see what's happening to their culture? Back in, 1973, when I was in college, we took a trip to London, to Britain. And I think the whole time I was there, I saw one person who wasn't white. That was, I can't do the math. What was that, 30, 45 years ago?
Yes.
But things have changed in one generation. And I'm wondering why they can't see that. Now, obviously, a lot of people can. You were an example. But what is blinding these people? Why do they keep calling us racist? Because all we're trying to do is defend our culture. That's the correct thing to do. I don't know how to phrase a question, Nick, but what's wrong with these people? How do they become so confused?
Well, what's wrong with them? I think that perhaps the clue is in the so-called Ash experiments, which were the experiments in the 1950s about how an individual's opinions were influenced by those of the majority around them. And they showed groups of college students lines and asked them, which is the longest line? And one person was giving the right answer, and all the others around him or her were programmed to give the wrong answer. And after several attempts at this, most of the people who actually really should know what length, which line was which, were simply going along with what the majority, who of course were stool pigeons in the experiment, were saying. And I think we're dealing here with huge social conditioning in the what you call the public schools, what we call the state schools, but throughout the education system, particularly the higher you go into the universities, and from the controlled mass media, and of course the people I was talking about shock troops earlier on, and the greedy power elite dominate the mass media throughout the Western world. So when everyone is telling people that one line is shorter than the others when it patently isn't, or that black is white, or that the destruction of the white race, which is genocide, is nevertheless a good thing, the weight of social conditioning really forces people to pretend otherwise. Years ago, I taught a lot of foreign students from Eastern Europe in the early 90s who had very recently lived under communism. And they all described feeling pretty much the same way at the time. They knew it was a lie, but they didn't dare say so because all their friends were saying it was fine. And they knew that if they spoke out, they could get into trouble at college, their parents could get into trouble at work, and so on. So it's a sort of intellectual terrorism which is being imposed on us. And, of course, we have in English an old phrase, monkey see, monkey do. And when the mass media constantly portray the things which are destroying the white race as good, and anyone who stands up against them as some kind of evil monster.
Gotta go to break. The music is playing. Sorry to interrupt you, but we'll be back in 3 minutes with more from Nick Griffin.
You're listening to the American Freedom Party News Hour with your host, Ken Daly.
My website is dailyken.com. That's spelled with 2 N's, by the way. And if you forget to put one of the N's in when you type in dailyken.com in your web browser, it's okay. It'll still get to my website. We're talking with Nick Griffin of the formerly president, chairman of the British National Party in the United Kingdom. And before we went to break, we were talking about the, I call it kind of a remedial psychology that's being used on us to convince us that we've got to go along with multiculturalism. And I was thinking during the break, this is the concept that was presented by Hegel. He came up with the concept of the zeitgeist, excuse me, for those of you who speak German, don't mean to offend you. That's the idea that society consists of a collective consciousness, kind of like this is my interpretation, but kind of like a flock of birds. One bird flies and they all fly. So we all kind of go in that same direction, and that was later popularized, I believe, by Schopenhauer, maybe some others. But that's what they're using on us to convince us that if we don't go along with what they call diversity, what they call multiculturalism, then we're racist, we're bigots, there's something wrong with us. You know, I've always wondered, they're for multiculturalism, but for some reason they hate Southern culture. They don't like that culture, so they're kind of selective even when they talk about diversity. So, Nick Griffin, do you want to expand on that a little bit? How are these people tinkering with our brains to bring us to the point where we are willing participants in self-destruction?
Indeed. Well, they're experts. If perhaps some of your listeners want to make a note of the name Edward Bernays, that's Bernays. He was a close associate of Sigmund Freud. There's a Freudian slip, of Sigmund Freud. And he was basically the man who invented modern advertising. A lot of it comes from him. A lot of it, in fact, does come from that period after the First World War. It's interesting you mentioned Hegel because, of course, his idea of dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, became, in effect, Marxism. And the Marxists have a lot to answer for in this. In 1926, there was almost a workers' rebellion in Britain, and it failed. And the Communist Party in Moscow analysed what had gone wrong. Why hadn't the workers risen up? And they concluded that the workers would never make a revolution in a society like Britain because it was stable, conservative with a small c, and Christian. And the workers were actually quite patriotic. So they decided that instead of trying to have a revolution from the bottom, they'd have a revolution from the top. And they decided to infiltrate communists and communist ideas into the top of British society, the churches, journalism, and the teacher training colleges and the universities. And this was copied in pretty much every other state around the world, certainly every other white state. It was picked up by the revisionist Marxists of the Frankfurt School, who were mainly radical leftist Jews in Germany before the war, who fled to mainly New York when the Nazis came to power. And they set about deconstructing Western society through constantly criticizing all of our most cherished institutions, the family, marriage, the church, the nation-state, all these foundation stones for a healthy society. They said, we're going to criticize these until we destroy them. And these people have, and their influence has gone from the top down, through the universities, through the political elite, and then it's imposed on the rest of us. And that's why it's so difficult to stand up against it, because there's enormous amounts of power and money being directed to convincing our kids that they're doing a moral thing in consenting to their own destruction.
Well, they control the media. You know, if you go to a movie, almost any movie, with a few exceptions, it's effectively a focus group where they're teaching us. By the way, I think it was Freud's nephew who invented the concept of the focus group. I could be wrong. But when you go to a theater to watch a cinematic production, effectively you're participating in a focus group in which you really don't participate. You just sit there and you learn. You're being brainwashed by what we call white guilt movies or whatever. And when you walk out of the cinema, you may not realize it at the moment, but your mind has been tampered with. Your mind has changed. You're not thinking clearly like you once did. Now, Nick, you may or may not be aware of this, but in the late 1960s, early 70s, there was a cultural program called the Rural Purge, in which television in the United States was abruptly changed. Prior to the late 1960s, virtually all television was white. Not that it has to be, but there were programs, and I don't know if you're familiar with these or not, very popular programs, well, like the Beverly Hillbillies and Mayberry RFD, and just fun shows about, a lot of them focused on country life, and just, there was no social commentary, they were just fun shows. Well, somebody came along and purged even those shows that were highly profitable. They took them off the air, and from that point going forward, virtually all we saw on television was multiculturalism. Every program had to have an element of non-whites, and often when white people were portrayed as the bad guys, and the non-whites were always the good guys. And they were tampering with our minds, and we didn't seem to notice because it was entertaining. We kind of enjoyed it, But, the good news is the latest white guilt movie that was presented in American theaters was Oprah Winfrey's Selma. The thing bombed at the box office. Thank goodness for that. But is that what you're talking about? They're tampering with our minds through the media?
Absolutely so, yes. It's a physiological fact that television sort of works in a somewhat hypnotic way on the mind. So it's an extraordinarily powerful tool, and it's in the hands of our enemies. And they've, as you say, for some decades now, been using it absolutely ruthlessly, very cleverly as well. If you think about some of the pure, absolute social poison and cultural poison which is now put out on television, the promotion of perversion, all sorts of hideous things. If they'd started off doing that right from the start, people would have woken up and resisted it. But they did it very gently to start with. It's the old idea of boiling a frog. If you drop the frog into boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you heat the water up slowly, the frog won't realise until it's too late that it's being boiled. And that's what they've been doing to our people's minds for decades. Having said which, I think it's important not to get too carried away with the idea these people are so powerful there's nothing can be done, because that way is, the way which leads people to despair and apathy. And if you look over the last 10, 15 years or so, the power of the mass media has been diminished enormously by the internet. Young people especially now are watching less and less television. They're more and more picking what they want to watch, what they want to do on the World Wide Web. And the extent to which the web is dominated by really very radical ideas, such as our own, the things we're discussing, shows that I think there is hope for the future. Hence, it's no surprise that Obama is just in the process of trying to get control of the internet. The people in power, the people running the mass media, and their political puppets do not like us being free to express our ideas and put them across to people on a medium which means that a limitless number of people can come across us, think for themselves.
The way that I like to phrase that is our minds have been infected by the multicultural virus, and the antidote for that virus, the cure, is reality. Just tell the truth. That applies to any cult, whether it's a religious cult, secular cult. The way to deprogram somebody is to compare their belief system with a reality. That's what I try to do with my website. Sometimes people yell at me when I do this, but sometimes I will post a video of a brawl in a black neighborhood. And the reason I do that is not to make black people look bad, but just to present reality. I mean, this is what's really happening. There's a reason why, Nick, that white liberals who are encumbered with white privilege live in white neighborhoods. They don't want to live in the black neighborhoods. They don't want to live in the housing projects. To me, that is terribly hypocritical, and so we pointed out. And like you say, that is one of the reasons that Obama in the Federal Communications Commission voted 3-2 rather, for net neutrality. They don't like my website. They don't like what you are doing on the website, on the internet rather, because we are bypassing the mainstream Marxist media. We're getting the truth out there, and it's very dangerous. Your thoughts on that? We're going to break. Sorry, we'll be back in a few minutes. We're talking with Nick Griffin. And you're not going to want to go away. We'll be back. Hang in there.
You're listening to the American Freedom Party News Hour with your host, Ken Daly.
The American Freedom Party web address is theamericanfreedomparty.us. We encourage you to visit the website. And while you're there, become an activist. Go ahead and join, be a part of us. No point in sitting back, being a spectator, when you can get involved and be a part of the solution. Once again, theamericanfreedomparty.us. We're speaking with Nick Griffin, formerly of the British National Party, where he was chairman and president, as well as member of the European Parliament 2009 to 2014. Question came to mind during break. Nick Griffin is Margaret Thatcher. Notoriously, Barack Obama, I hate to call him President Obama because to me he's more of a dictator than a president. But Barack Obama notoriously snubbed the memorial service of Margaret Thatcher, and he took a little bit of heat over that. I don't think he cared, but that's what happened. He went to the memorial service for Nelson Mandela, who in my mind is the world's most beloved terrorist, but he didn't care for Margaret Thatcher. So I'm curious, what is Nick Griffin's thoughts on her?
Yes, Ken, that's a very interesting question. Before I answer it, can I just say one thing about what we were discussing before the break, just to finish off? Yep. You were absolutely right when you say that liberalism and multiculturalism, the White Genocide Project, it is a cult. It is a sort of godless religious cult. And that reality is the way to deal with it. One other thing, mockery. If you look at the history of all the great religions and when they've finally been cut down to size, as it were, it's mockery is the main thing that's done it, because you can't argue with people who've got a cult belief. The more you teach them about reality, the more they stick to their weird beliefs. The one thing that strange religions can't stand is mockery. And I think that what's coming out of the United States, things, for instance, like White Rabbit Radio, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with, using cartoons to mock the multicultural cult, I think that's a really powerful thing, and let's see a lot more of it. So, coming on to Margaret Thatcher, briefly, as a human being, as a woman, she was very brave. She'd certainly got a lot more balls than all the men in Parliament put together. And she was a remarkable character. But she was not a conservative. She was a 19th century free trade liberal, and she did some terrible things to Britain. When she set about breaking the communist stranglehold in the trade unions, that needed to be done. That was a good thing. The British economy was being strangled by those people. But having broken them, at that moment, she had the opportunity to modernize British industry, to rebuild British industry, to make Britain an effective world competitor again. And instead of that, she just allowed the whole lot to shut down. And she said, it's okay, we'll get by with call centers. And for a few years, the men who had worked in real industries, in coal and steel, real wealth-producing industries, for a few years, some of them, the younger ones, were redeployed to call centers. And then, of course, the call centers in turn were all shut down and shipped out to Bombay. And Thatcher deindustrialized and consumerized the British society, and it's all been financed on enormous bank debt, which perhaps isn't surprising, because in the end, for all that she was a remarkable character as an individual, she was still part of a political system which is in the pockets of the big banks. She was a staunch Zionist. She was, in the end, perhaps a friend of Britain, but no friend of the British people and no friend of the white race.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I vaguely remember that she imposed a poll tax. Is that correct? Where everybody had to pay a
she
tax
imposed the poll tax. One of the reasons that Great Britain is now steadily breaking up is that she tried it out first on Scotland, and it was a monstrously unfair tax, especially in a part of the United Kingdom whose wealth had been based on heavy industry. So she allowed the destruction of heavy industry, and at the same time imposed a flat tax which hit poorest people the most. And she imposed it on the Scots first, and it created an enormous amount of resentment. And we're still having that problem, festering away in British society today. Perhaps most of all, a lot of people like the Nigel Farage and the people who support the UK Independence Party now, they say, oh, well, Maggie Thatcher stood up to Europe, and so on. And belatedly, she did. At one stage, she threatened to wave a handbag around, and she got us back a significant proportion of the money we were paying to be ruled by unelected foreigners in Brussels. But equally, it was Margaret Thatcher who, in 1987, signed up to the Single European Act, which is the most important thing which is creating a federal states of Europe. It was the key building block of this. And then a few years later, she seemed to be surprised that Britain was being sucked into ever greater union with the European Union. Well, the clue was in the title, really, wasn't it? Single European Act. She should have known. If she didn't know, she was a fool. If she did know, she was a traitor.
Well, she wasn't stupid. We know that. She certainly was a brilliant woman. So that holds her accountable. Well, while we're talking about people, what are your thoughts on Marine Le Pen and what's going on in France? Well, Europe as a whole. What are your thoughts on the movement to restore? I call it the restoration movement, to restore Europe to what it was before it was invaded. Kind of a prognosis.
Fundamentally, yeah. It's people like Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, Alternative for Deutschland, these essentially civic nationalist parties springing up around Europe, They're better than nothing, I think, as part of the historical process. They show the people waking up. But anyone who thinks that someone like Marine Le Pen is going to save France or Europe is utterly mad. Marine Le Pen talks about Islam and the threat of Islam, and of course she's right. But she also says that as long as immigrants come from Africa and so on, and they're either Christian or they assimilate to the French ways and they salute the French flag and sing the French national anthem, then they're welcome. Now, to my mind, if you're going to have two different ethnic groups coming into a white nation, and you've got a choice between Africans who want to integrate and Muslims who want to stay separate, then in genetic terms, in ethnic terms, in racial terms, you're better off with the hate-filled Muslims. Because the actual long-term killing danger, we could be ruled by Islam for hundreds of years. Spain was. And Spain had a Reconquista, and they threw them out. The one thing which destroys you forever is miscegenation, racial integration, and that's what all these parties which claim to be nationalist, which the liberal media say are racist and fascist. In fact, they're all integrationist, and if they had their way, we'd disappear through mass integration with non-Muslim immigrants quicker than even we are now. So I've got a big, big problem with them on that. Likewise with Marine Le Pen, you can't divorce what's being done to us genetically from the deliberate cultural destruction of European culture and of our fundamental Christian religion. And when 1 million French people marched in Paris 2 years ago, I was on the march, they were marching in favour of marriage, in favour of the rights of children to have a mum and a dad, against the socialist gay marriage proposals. And Marine Le Pen said Front National members shouldn't go on that march because the question of gay marriage was nothing to do with the Front National. Well, it certainly is a lot to do with proper nationalists. So, as I say, she's better than nothing. She's a lot better than the others, but it's only a stepping stone to people waking up and something being done to save France and save countries like it.
So it's a step in the right direction, but one step is just not sufficient. We've got a long way to go. And that brings to mind this question: when the bad guys refer to us as the far right, do you agree with that? Are we extremists? Are we far right? Are we just common sense?
Well, I'm certainly not far right. I'm a socialist in economic terms. That's probably an appalling thing to say in America, I suspect. But I think we probably mean different things by socialism. But I believe there is such a thing as society. I believe that the rampant greed and sheer destructiveness of global capitalism is something which has to be resisted. So, no, I'm not far right at all. But the label is convenient, and I suppose in French revolutionary terms, yes, the others are on the left of the chamber, and we are on the right of the chamber. So it's not a label which I get too uptight about, but I don't actually think it's accurate at all. And I think that if the world is going to resist the globalizers, the New World Order freaks, then that has to, in due course, include peoples and movements that at present are perceived as being on the left, and people perceived as being on the right. In global terms now, you've got the New World Order out of New York, London, and Brussels, trying to conquer the world, and you've got the resistance is obviously led by Russia and President Putin, but a country like Venezuela is going to be part of that resistance, and that's, by the old lines, a left-wing state.